morning and welcome to our broadcast this morning. This is the Rights and Security program. It's a public affairs webcast on Prism magazine. Today we're talking about the bizarre case of Abousfian Abdelrazik. He was a Canadian man, he is a Canadian man who was imprisoned in his native country on a return trip to visit his sick mother and had to fight to exercise his right of return to Canada. Our guests today are people who've been very involved in this case. We have with us Mary Foster, who is an activist in Montreal, and we have Paul Champ, who is a rights lawyer here in Ottawa. And we're joined today by Paul Coring, a Washington correspondent for the Globe and Mail, who has been very active in writing about this case, and in fact, his journalism on the case has won many awards. Good morning to all of you. We're going to start this morning actually hearing from the man himself, Abousfian Abdelrazik. He is on tape here, and we're going to roll the tape of an interview with him.
Since the decision came out and up to this moment, now we are celebrating the victory. For me, this is the occasion I wait for a long time, like 8 years, 7 years since my detention. It changed a lot in my life. I cannot say just like everything is changed completely, but I feel peace in my side and I feel free. And now I feel like I come to become one of the Canadians who's have normal life. Even the way even I deal with my computer is different than before, you know, and it's a very good feeling, and just I starting that to put everything as normal as before, but when I sit down to myself and I see from 2003 up to 2011, this period of time I look is like you know, the bridge fall down and you cannot cross it, you know. Many things is drawn in that when this bridge fall down in the river, many things is drawn, and I saw them just and I want to grab them back, but it's very difficult to bring everything like before. But I have the courage just to continue and to do my life as normal. And my message to the people who's created all these things, I advise them just like they are human beings. Advise them just like to think again about it and to free everybody on the list or on the prison cause of terrorism things. I guess it's not. Islam is peaceful religion, and we want everybody in the planet to live in peace and to enjoy his life against the war, against the killing of the innocent people, against everything. And the life is beautiful, and I wish everybody enjoy his life and to live it in peaceful and freedom and without no fear, without no detention, without no this is stuff, you know. Unless it's somebody he make very obvious mistakes, this is normal to have to be stop not to do it, to continue to do the mistakes. This is normal thing, but yes, without no reason to attack the people because of color or religions or race or whatever, I guess it's not a very good thing. Thanks.
Okay, we heard in that clip Mr. Abdelrazik say that his experience had changed his life. Now, he's had several major changes in his life. He started off in, well, Mary, you've spent time with him since his return. Why don't you tell us about who this man is, where he is from, and how he came to be a Canadian in the first place?
Sure. I've got to know him since he returned from Sudan in 2009. And he originally came to Canada as a refugee, seeking refuge from Sudan after there was a coup, a military coup, and a very a repressive government came to power. He had to flee, and his story of getting to Canada is itself quite a tale. He had to flee, and he eventually found his way to Canada, where he received a welcome, and describing the kind of peace that he felt when he got to Canada and felt that he had a place where he could start a family and have a normal life, as he calls it, is very, it's something that you want to erase the next few years that came when you hear that first story. So he then set up his life in Montreal. He got married. He started a family. And some years later, through his community, he became a target of interest for the security agencies in Canada. And at that time, he simultaneously lost his wife in Canada. She died from cancer. And his mother became very ill in Sudan. And so all of these factors together made him decide to risk going back to Sudan, in which a lot of things had changed. There'd been an amnesty for political prisoners, and so he felt it was safe at that time to go back. And he dearly wanted to see his mother, who he hadn't seen in all those years. So he did go back. And at that point, he came to a new trial that I think is probably...
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute.
Exactly.
But just going back, when he originally left Sudan, what kind of difficulty was he in with the new regime there? What was their beef with him?
At that point, he was working in a factory, and the factory went on strike. And he participated in the strike, and he was arrested during that strike. And he was treated very brutally in the prisons at that time. And when he was released, his family counseled him to leave the country and that he wouldn't have peace because he was now someone that the state was watching in Sudan.
Okay. I'm going to turn to Paul Champ now to pick up the thread of the story. He goes back to Sudan to visit his sick mother. And then what happens?
Well, he traveled back to Sudan in 2003, which is over 10 years after he had left Sudan. And he was there for a few months, visiting with his mother and his brothers. Shortly before he was to return to Canada, however, he was suddenly arrested off the street by the Sudanese intelligence service, the NSI, the National Security Intelligence. And that was in September 2003, and that sort of started his new trial, shall we say. He remained in custody on and off for over 3 years. He was tortured while he was in detention. He was interrogated by Canadian security intelligence agents while in detention. And then once he was finally released in 2006, he was barred from returning to Canada. He was unable to return to his children who were here. And it took several more years of fighting to try to get back to Canada, which fortunately eventually happened by order of a court in June 2009.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, Paul Coring, when did you first become aware of this case? You did the initial reporting as well as all the follow-ups that have been very, I would have to say, very helpful in bringing the story to other Canadians. When did you first hear of Abdelrazik?
Well, I first heard of him, and I don't. Thank you for the nice comments about the reporting, but in fairness, I didn't uncover this. This was Abdelrazik's family and his friends had sought legal help while he was in Sudan, and it was lawyers, including Paul Champ, who I first contacted about this. So my knowledge of the Abdelrazik case initially came secondhand. It wasn't something I ferreted out by myself. I wasn't aware of his situation until I heard about it through others. But it did strike me, particularly in the middle of the decade when the whole world was sort of piling on the Bush administration for real and imagined rights abuses, that this was a quite remarkable instance, not the only one either, where the whatever the American government did or did not do to non-Americans, it was far more respectful of American citizenship than it seemed that the Canadian government was respectful of Canadian citizenship. And whereas lots of other governments, for instance, were trying to get their nationals out of Guantanamo and get them home, the Canadian government wasn't interested in that. Successive Canadian governments weren't interested in that. And we had these various instances where Canadians who got into difficulty abroad were more or less ignored by the government, or in some cases, their lives were made more difficult. Abdelrazik's case had a whole new level because it looked like, number one, he may have been pressured to leave the country by government agents. It looked like there was some fairly powerful evidence that he was picked up by the Sudanese at the behest, if not the direct request, of Canadian security authorities. I mean, they continue to deny that to this day, but when a federal court judge said they were implicated in it, they didn't challenge that. So it's a fact until it's proven otherwise. So, I mean, the Abdelrazik's personal case is interesting, although there are still many unexplained things about his life and his travels. The issue is what's really important, which is whether or not Canadian citizens have rights that their government must uphold and must defend, and can't just run roughshod over because it suits the political climate.
You mentioned that the Canadian government may have been pressuring him to leave the country. What's the story there?
Well, I mean, this is very hard to tell because, of course, CSIS won't talk about it, and so you only have Mr. Abdelrazik's version of events. But he speaks of continued interrogations while he was still in Montreal, of being stopped in the street, of at least on one occasion calling the Montreal police to complain about the fact that a pair of CSIS agents were kind of having a public interrogation or altercation with him. And it's very hard to test these things because CSIS, aside from blanket denial saying, you know, we never did anything wrong because it's our policy never to do anything wrong, they won't address the specifics of the situation. And there's lots of litigation still to come, which Paul Champ can speak to. But my guess is that by that time, this whole sordid event is finally known, that the behavior of the people supposedly protecting Canadian rights will turn out to be rather sordid and unpleasant and disgusting.
Paul Champ, you had some thoughts in this regard. What do you think?
Well, I was just going to add a little bit about what Mr. Abdelrazik was experiencing before he left Canada. The security intelligence agents were following him for a few years, stopping him on the street, seeing family members and friends, his in-laws. They were going to see his mother-in-law and father-in-law and trying to suggest to them that he was involved in criminal activities and that maybe their daughter should leave him. When his wife was ill with cancer in the hospital, CSIS agents were going to see her when he wasn't there to try to interview her. Pretty disgusting behavior. And as well, the Montreal police incident, they refused to leave his home one time when he asked them to leave, and they waited until the Montreal police came. Those are actually things that they've admitted to, that he called the Montreal police and they wouldn't leave until the Montreal police arrived. So You know, it's something that we've seen with a lot of Muslim Canadians, actually, that kind of conduct by the security intelligence officials. There's many other Canadians have complained of that kind of harassment by CSIS. And frankly, there are some CSIS documents that show that that was a bit of a tactic. They called it disruption, you know, this sort of conspicuous surveillance of people they thought were in some way risks. They thought this was an acceptable tactic to harass people and surveil them in conspicuous ways to cause them distress. And that's what happened with Mr. Abdelrazik, and that was another factor in why he chose to, in a sense, take a break from Canada for a little while to go back and visit his family.
Now, he came to the attention of Canadian authorities before 9/11, and if I recall correctly, it was an association or some kind of a meeting with another figure, the so-called Millennium Bomber, Rassam. Mary, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's been alleged or named that he was a close associate of Ahmad Rassam's. The way Mr. Abdelrazik expresses it, he knew Rassam in the way that he knew many members of the Muslim community in Montreal.
They belong to the same mosque, I believe. Is that right?
People don't necessarily belong to a mosque, but they frequently prayed at the same mosque. They lived in the same area. If you know Montreal, it's fairly ghettoized, so the Arab community, the Muslim Arab community tends to live in one area, and there's a large mosque there which many people go and pray at if they happen to be in that area at that time of day. So yeah, exactly. It was a connection of knowing other people from the same region and affinity, both religious and community-wise, and that on that level of association, it seems that the security agencies drew conclusions or jumped to conclusions that weren't true about the level of association. At the same time, when Mr. Rassam was arrested in the States, RCMP asked Mr. Abdelrazik to testify in his case, and willingly, of his own free will, he did testify. He testified, in fact, against Mr. Rassam at that time. So that, again, speaks, I think, to the kind of association that they had and against the way that association is depicted when you read some of the documents that the authorities have put out at various times.
When he testified in the Rassam
You know,
case.
Jeff, just let me jump in here for a second, because quite frankly, while there is nothing to suggest anywhere that the authorities had sort of a makeable case against Mr. Abdelrazik, and quite the contrary, eventually both CSIS and the RCMP said they didn't have active files. But I think it's also important that there not be any attempt to sort of to come to the conclusion that Mr. Abdelrazik wasn't associating with or friends with or in contact with other people who came to the attention of the security authorities. And I'm not suggesting any guilt by association here, nor am I suggesting that some of his unexplained or still not fully explained travels in the 90s suggest any guilt by association either. But let's also be fair to security agencies, and that is that one of the things they do is that they look at webs and networks. And so the mere fact that he came under initial surveillance or it was ongoing surveillance is not in and of itself either suggests that he'd done anything wrong, nor does it suggest that CSIS behaved wrongly, at least initially. I mean, we just don't know yet, and we need to know whether this was willful and unwarranted and ongoing deliberate harassment. The mere fact that people are surveilled and followed is something that security agencies do. And so just as we can't really come to a judgment yet about CSIS, and I'm not being an apologist for them, there are still unexplained aspects of Mr. Abdelrazik's journey, none of which suggests that he's done anything wrong, but they're unexplained, and it's reasonable for the security agencies to want to understand them.
Paul Champ, what about this? What about the notion that guilt by association may have been the first hurdle that brought Mr. Abdelrazik down, and unexplained travel activities.
Well, I mean, Paul raises an important point about, what are the function of intelligence agents. And, before the past 10 years, I think, or the last decade since 9/11, I think a lot of people didn't think a lot about what the activities of intelligence agents were, intelligence services. And I think that the consequences for individuals were probably not very significant, and that's part of the reason why people didn't worry about it. But what we have seen in the last decade is that there has been serious civil liberties consequences for many Canadians and individuals as a result of the activities of intelligence agents. The move from what I guess we could call a criminal paradigm, if Canadian officials ever felt that Mr. Abdelrazik or others had engaged in criminal activities, then you bring a case and you charge someone, you put them on trial. Those are very fundamental, basic tenets of our free and democratic society. That if you've done something wrong, we'll put you on trial and then you will be convicted. The fact that Mr. Abdelrazik knew some people who were later convicted of crimes, it's understandable. What Paul is saying is that he would come under some scrutiny because of that. But the big part of his case is what happened since then. And there's sort of two aspects to that. One is his detention abroad and torture. That is something that has happened to other Canadians, not only the famous cases of, well, obviously Mr. Arar, but Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed al-Mahdi, and Moyad Noordin. Those are well-known cases, but there are many other cases of other Canadian citizens that are less well-known, of being detained in Libya. We've learned now since Libya fell that there was a Canadian detained in Libya who Canadian intelligence agencies were assisting the Libyan intelligence officials. Tunisia, Morocco. When you see Canada, the Canadian intelligence agents working against the rights of Canadian citizens with these notorious human rights abusers and torturers in Egypt, Syria, Sudan, that's a serious problem, and Mr. Abdelrazik falls into that category, and I think that is a serious concern. And the second aspect, which we haven't really touched on yet, is this listing regime that he was under for a long period of time. That was the primary means by which his return to Canada was blocked. He was put on an international blacklist that not only prevented his travels or interfered with his travels, but even once he came back to Canada, basically all of his civil relations were regulated by law. He couldn't have a bank account. If he tried to get a job, he was prevented from doing that, or it would be a criminal offense for anyone to pay him a wage. Those kinds of issues are very, very serious, and the first point that Paul makes is that intelligence agencies have a function, and given Mr. Abdelrazik's associations in the 90s, would he have come to the attention of those intelligence agencies, and should have they looked into his activities further? I can concede that point for now, but the question is, for us today in 2012, what do intelligence agencies do with that kind of information? And we're in a very different world now in the past decade. It's not just passive surveillance. Intelligence agencies are being involved in activities that have very profound impacts on individuals' lives and rights. In some ways, far more serious than a wrongful conviction can be. And we don't really have, there's no accountability for intelligence agents. If a police force violates someone's rights, there's going to be a trial and maybe the charges are thrown out because of a human rights violation. You don't have that kind of process for someone who is, in a sense, wrongfully accused by intelligence agents as opposed to police officers. And those are the kinds of very serious human rights issues that Mr. Abdelrazik's case raises and unfortunately still have not been resolved in my mind.
And that's why this is so important beyond Mr. Abdelrazik himself. And you see, I get lots of comments and emails after you write a story about this particular case, and far too many of them, in my view, are sort of, where there's smoke, there's fire, and if he's going to hang out with those kind of people, he has to expect that sort of treatment. And that's the really slippery slope here for Canadians and for other sort of modern Western civil societies, because the issue is not what a particular individual does or doesn't do and what kind of surveillance that may merit. It's people need to imagine that the completely and absolutely innocent, and perhaps Mr. Abdelrazik is one, could be harassed and detained and tortured abroad with the active connivance of Canadian agencies for a decade. So the merits of the particular case are very, very important because, because there's perhaps justifiable redress here, but there's also something far broader than that, and that is the very real important sort of question that all Canadians have to ask themselves, and that is, what if this was happening to me or my child or my friend, and it was wholly unwarranted? And what kind of a system are we running here?
Mary, you had a thought.
Yeah, I did. Quite a few thoughts. I think Paul raises a really good point that many people have, and I've heard this repeated over and over again, where there's smoke, there's fire, and that seems to have replaced a principle that used to be quite well broadly held, which is an assumption of innocence. Now, this idea that because the security agencies have raised questions about someone, those questions remain unexplained, I think runs counter to this presumption of innocence. I've, in my life, have had many unexplained travels. I've traveled to many places. I have never had to explain those travels to anyone. I could, and I believe Mr. Abdelrazik has explained his travels to the extent that he needs to the public. I also think he's explained his associations. He's been very frank that he has friendships with people who are of interest to CSIS, but that, he says, are innocent relationships, just as I have had relationships with people who are now or will in the future shortly be in prison due to some of their political activism. I believe those relationships are innocent relationships. So I think I remember we were in a situation once where Mr. Abdelrazik was in a public setting, and he was asked, explain your story. Start from when you were born. And I think that's where the logic brings us to, if we start this question, there are many unexplained stories in his life. Many unexplained questions in his life. Yes, but I don't think that puts an onus on him to explain every detail of his life when we know certain fundamentals, which are that he has never been charged for any of these activities, that nothing has ever been brought to a level where he has had an opportunity to explain those in court, where there are rules of the game set out and accountability, where he could fairly respond to some of those questions. And I think that's why I tend to try, when I'm talking about a story, to steer away from some of those questions, because I think they have a much broader implication, exactly as Paul says, which is that it's not just about Mr. Abdelrazik, it's about Mr. Abdelrazik and his community. And I think what drives some of these questions, why these questions are unexplained in Mr. Abdelrazik and people of his profile, is that certain profiles are regarded as more dangerous than others. And I think many Muslims in Montreal have come under similar scrutiny. And I think it's it's not realistic to think that there's, I think it's a false image to think of our security as sort of scanning all of society with an equal gaze. It doesn't. It profiles people, and it focuses in on certain communities of profile. The Muslims are certainly one of them, but we could name other communities as well that are heavily scrutinized by security. And once that happens, innocent activities come to look at suspicious as well. And I think many of the cases that Paul Champ has dealt with as well speak to that level of profiling and that level of racism against certain communities in Canada.
Paul Coring, I think, from my viewing this from a distance, that publicity probably played a major role in his eventual return. Now, it was many years before his family, his champions, wanted to go public on this. We've seen other cases, though, where, the Meher Arar case, for example, because it got a lot of publicity fairly early on, was resolved in comparison. These are all relative terms, but was eventually resolved in less time than it took Mr. Abdelrazik. What would your advice be to other Canadians who might find themselves in this situation? And I'm thinking in particular an extreme case where we had Bob Fowler, a Canadian diplomat who was kidnapped elsewhere in Africa, and there was pretty much a tight information clamp kept on that. What are Canadians to do? Should they trust their government to help them, or do they need to make a big stink or have associates make a big noise to get them free?
Well, I mean, I have to confess an inevitable sort of journalistic bias. I think the oxygen of publicity is a good thing, and I think governments, even those that are supposedly principled and upright and honest and decent, need to be held publicly to account, because quite frankly, just like the allegations against individuals, governments that have nothing to hide should be able to explain their activity. So I guess I would say that the publicity never hurts, but nor is it a panacea. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, there are cases, and however you feel about the outcome of it. I mean, you look at Omar Khadr, who's, you know, getting on for a decade in prison, and it's now months since he was supposed to be repatriated, and there's been an enormous amount of coverage of his case, not just in the Globe and Mail, but frankly, other organizations in Canada, other news organizations, and internationally, his case has got enormous amount of coverage, and yet lots of people have literally lost interest in the fate of the Guantanamo detainees. It was easy to beat up on the Bush administration about Guantanamo, but somehow it's a lot less. There's a lot less interest in beating up on the Obama administration for the president's failure to deliver on his promise to close it down. So there's no single answer, and certainly in Mr. Abdelrazik's case, there's no question that the legal efforts of his legal advocates and the ruling of the federal court judge and the activism by ordinary Canadians, including basically calling the government's bluff by buying him a ticket, because, you know, you had the ridiculous situation of a minister of the Crown saying, well, I guess he can come home, but somebody else has to buy him a ticket. I mean, and so they called the government out on it. And if the government was embarrassed, well, it should have been. And perhaps it wasn't embarrassed enough.
I want to talk a little bit more about the politics of the situation. Abdelrazik's case began at a time when the Liberals were the government. But there seemed to be an awful lot of foot dragging on the part of the Conservatives once they came to office. Paul Champ, why do you think it is that they basically were following the same line as the previous government?
Well, I think there's a few reasons why. You know, Paul Coring raises a couple interesting points, that the public seems to be losing some of its interest on some of these national security cases. I'm worried. It's sort of like in the United States, after President Obama was elected, people kind of felt, well, the Guantanamo Bay situation is fixed. In Canada, it's sort of like after the Meher Arar inquiry and compensation for Mr. Arar, people felt, well, that issue was fixed. But unfortunately, it's not. You know, the gaze turns elsewhere, and we have to try to bring it back. I think that this is just my personal opinion, but, you know, we've seen the settlement with Mr. Arar back in '07, and there has not been any effort on the part of the government to, the current government that is, to really redress any of the other wrongs that have been committed. You know, we had the Akabuchi inquiry. Canadian citizens spent, you know, I think that inquiry cost over $30 million. finding that Canadian officials were directly or indirectly complicit in the detention and torture of other Canadians abroad, yet those individuals have not been compensated. In Mr. Abdelrazik's case, we have a federal court judgment saying that intelligence agents were complicit in his detention abroad. So it's a bit troubling that you know, it seemed like the Liberal government, when they were leaving, were waking up to some of perhaps the mistakes that had been made from 9/11 until, you know, 2005, 2006. You know, the Arar inquiry itself, that was just the fact that the government, the Liberal government called that inquiry was a bit of a victory in a sense, I think, for human rights activists and civil society, and I felt that that was a bit of a process of the government waking up to it. We also know, you know, our CMP Commissioner, Zakardeli, ultimately resigned because of his activities' involvement in the wrongdoings associated with Mr. Arar's case. But what has happened since then? It seems like the Harper government, when they first came into power, were following that path of, okay, let's look at what we did wrong and try to fix it. They did that for a little while. But I have to confess, I think now that the current government is, after they compensated Mr. Arar, I think there was a bit of a backlash against the Conservative government's sort of base constituency, who felt that, frankly, it was wrong to give money to a Muslim Canadian, even though his rights were violated. I think there is a bit of a dark, ugly racist undertone to why there has not been more accountability for these cases, and I'll say that quite frankly, it's a bit disturbing. And I mean, if you follow some of these news stories and you look at the comments and you see some of the public comments, sometimes there are some vicious things that are said about Muslim Canadians generally, and even individuals such as Mr. Arar. And I think, frankly, I think the government has just decided that the Muslim community is sufficiently small, that there's no political advantage in trying to correct the situation. And so with Mr. Abdelrazik's case, I don't think we're going to get any sort of redress or accountability unless it's through the courts. It's wonderful that we have activists like Mary Foster, and there's many Canadians. I won't say there's not a lot of Canadians. Like, I'd say there's a good significant proportion of Canadians, you know, 20 to 30%, who are deeply concerned about these human rights issues and understand them. But unfortunately, I think for the government of the day, that's just it's not a sufficient number or level of Canadians for them to really care and fix these situations.
Okay,
you know, as citizens, and despite, you know, we all have our jobs and we all have our roles, but we are all citizens too. And if Paul is right, and he probably is, that there's a 10, 20, 30% of Canadians who find these issues important enough to galvanize them, and therefore not much is happening. You know, it's easy to rail against security agents, and it's easy to rail against sort of ministers who seem to lack principle, but ultimately the guardians of rights in a democracy are the citizenry itself. And so if we collectively don't hold our government and their agents to account, then we too are culpable in this, and that's not a pious thought. It's a reality. It's you know, how does your family, how do your own children, how do your own colleagues feel about things like indefinite detention? I mean, it's not a hypothetical. It exists in Western democracies right now.
Okay, now Abdelrazik had to get off of not just one, but several blacklists before he could travel, including the UN blacklist that Mary has spoken about. Is he still on a blacklist? Can he come visit you, Paul, in Washington?
No, he's, well, I don't know that because the blacklist is secret, but I think it's fair to say that Abdelrazik, like Mr. Arar and various other people, are unwelcome in the United States. But, you know, that's a little bit different because whether or not they should be on those blacklists, visiting a country that's not your own is not a right. It's not like the right to go home. It's not like the right of a citizen to remain and return to his own country. So whatever you think of the merits of the U.S. No-fly list or blacklist, or whatever you think of the Canadian no-fly list. I mean, you know, there are Americans that the government of Canada won't let into the country, and they don't have to explain themselves. They just have to say, we don't want you. And it's a bit like your house. If you don't want somebody in your house for good or bad reasons, you have the right to say so. So the fact that he's still on American blacklists, and I think he probably is not an infringement of his rights the way he was when Canada was denying a citizen's right to return. I mean, you just can't imagine the brouhaha that would be in the United States if an American citizen was denied the right to return to the United States of America. I mean, it's really astonishing that successive Canadian governments got away with that for 5 or 6 years.
Paul Champ, what do you say?
I'll just say very quickly, you know, there were some cases like that, Paul, where American citizens abroad were denied their passport, returning their passports as a means to block them from returning to the U.S. The American Civil Liberties Union lawyers, who I speak with quite regularly, whenever they launched those lawsuits, the government settled immediately, and those individuals were allowed to return home. So.
No, you're absolutely right that there have been instances like that, but 6 years of successfully denying a citizen's right to return. I mean, not that the American government, you know, they brought one guy back from Afghanistan, an American citizen, bound and gagged and masked in a troop transport before charging him. So it's this is not all sweetness and light at all. But I was making the point that Abdelrazik has a right to return to Canada, his country of which he's a citizen. He has no right to go to the United States if the Americans don't want him.
Paul, thanks. We've got a couple of questions now that have come in by email. Professor Reg Whitaker from British Columbia, who is a well-known figure in Canada on these security issues, he wants to know, to what degree was the so-called case against Abdelrazik the result of CSIS acting on behalf of the Americans, and to what extent may it have originated with CSIS and the RCMP? Reg Whitaker says, there seems to be a discrepancy between what the two Canadian agencies told Mr. Justice Zinn and what has been reported about their behind-the-scenes advice keeping Abdelrazik in Sudan and collaborating in placing him on the UN blacklist. What about that? Mary, what do you think?
Well, I think Paul Champ is probably going to speak a little bit more specifically to that, but it seems as though a lot of the so-called case was originally from Canada, who then shared it with their partners. That's the way I understand it from the documents I've read that have come out through the court case and through Mr. Abdelrazik's own experience of the questions he was asked at the different times, which were largely about Canada and his activities in Canada.
Now, he says that during his detention he was tortured. Has he ever spoken publicly about exactly what his ordeal was like?
Mm-hmm. He has. He's spoken a number of times about the beatings, insults, being hung by his wrists from a door frame, having his head slammed repeatedly against the wall. So he has spoken about, to some degree, about what he experienced.
Right. I've interviewed him on this matter, as have others, and for what it's worth in terms of corroboration, the descriptions he gives are entirely consistent with reports from other contemporary prisoners of Sudanese authorities at the same time in the same place, and from international rights agencies who've done secondary reporting on it. So the story fits.
Paul Champ, we seem to know that it was at the behest of the Canadian government that he was originally arrested in Sudan, and he was tortured there, according to his own account. Do you think that the Canadian government should have known or expected that something like this would happen with a Canadian citizen if he was taken into custody in Sudan?
I think without a doubt, Jeff. I think that the human rights records of not only countries like Sudan and Syria and Egypt, but in particular the agencies, the specific agencies that are involved in some of these cases. The NSI, the National Security Intelligence Agency of Sudan, is notorious. Well, even right now, the president of Sudan is indicted in International Court of Justice. So, should they have known? I don't think you could imagine any other country. There's a small list of countries that are known for torture, like systematic torture, as a matter of regular interrogation. Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Sudan, those kinds of countries. It's not just occasional or rogue agents. It's Afghanistan's another one. It's part of their regular methods and practices. So should they have known? Absolutely. If they had asked their colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs, they have human rights reports on those countries, and the practice of torture was very well known, and they absolutely would have known that he would be tortured, in my view.
And it was almost admitted. There's one document, quite frankly, that the government definitely needs to explain, in which it seems that the Sudanese are exasperated with the Canadians for the stalling and leaving him there. And the Sudanese essentially say, and these are the words of a Canadian diplomat reporting back, that they offer to disappear him. I mean, the clear implication is they offer to murder him. And amazingly, Ottawa sends back a message that says, well, just don't reply. In effect, it was, cover your eyes, and if the worst happens, so be it. Pretty tough stuff, and still unexplained.
There's running through all of this is the question of accountability. We've been talking about the government, or the RCMP, or CSIS, but these were things done by people to their fellow Canadian citizens, and we have a question from a viewer who wants to know about accountability. This calls from Paul Repstock, who is a very active Prism reader, and he asks, how would it be possible to change the regulatory structure in such a way that an individual investigator must have their name published in any investigation or accusation rather than just having the judgment based on a faceless bureaucracy? Any thoughts, Paul Champ?
I think it's an interesting question, and Mary might have some thoughts on that too. But in my cases, I think about that all the time in terms of the individual responsibility. I try in my cross-examinations, and in my many cases, I've cross-examined military officials, foreign affairs officials, intelligence agents. I try to very pointedly raise with those individuals their individual responsibility for what has happened. And I can tell you that almost uniformly, they have this sort of mindset that they were just doing their job. It's very chilling. They try to deny any individual responsibility for what ultimately happened to particular individuals. You can show them evidence that makes it unequivocal that someone was tortured as a result of their actions, and their response is often, well, I didn't know that was going to happen, and I was just doing my job. So I think that is something that can be very effective, or should be very effective, and that is the naming of individuals. You look at right now, Superintendent Cabana with the RCMP, who was very involved in Mr. Arar's case, he's now an assistant commissioner. How did that happen? I had another case just this last week that I can't name specifically, where I was involved with another RCMP officer who was also closely involved in Mr. Arar's case and some other cases, and he was just enjoying his third promotion since that time. Well, what are we doing when the Canadian citizens are paying $10 million to Mr. Arar, but the individuals responsible are being promoted, or it seems are evading any kind of individual responsibility? I think that is a very serious problem.
Paul Curran?
No, there's two kinds of accountability here, and the first one is, security agents and police officers and diplomats have legal obligations too, and if they overstep them or fail to do their jobs, then they need to be held criminally responsible. And those cases will be few and far between, but they need to be pursued. More broadly, and perhaps more importantly because it sets the tone, is ministerial responsibility. As long as underlings can get away with things, they will get away with things. It's only, and you know, this applies in sort of everything from the operation of a small business to running an army in the battlefield. If it's not the guys at the top who fall and who are held accountable for atrocities and crimes and wrongdoings, then the little guys, perhaps under some pressure, will do atrocious things, and they will always seek refuge in the sort of "I was only doing my job" defense. And we've heard it for centuries, and we'll continue to hear it until there's accountability at the top. And you see it sometimes. You see ministers and senior leaders who take the fall because they think it's the right thing to do. We probably don't see it enough.
In terms of systems of accountability, I think that the big guys won't be held accountable until people step up, just as Paul Coring was saying earlier. People step up and see this as part of our political responsibility to hold people accountable. And that's the kind of political work we've been trying to do in Montreal around these cases. It's our responsibility to hold these officials accountable and ensure that it's not possible for them to continue in roles or be promoted as in the example that Paul Champ just gave, but be brought to justice or certainly not continue in a public office.
The question of accountability, though, of individuals who are doing and saying things, and even if their defense is, I was only doing my job, I was following orders, there's still an awful lot of secrecy involved as to who it is. If I were to run into trouble with the law in Montreal, I would see a badge number. I would be able to identify the police officer. What's the rationale for the extreme secrecy in the case of CSIS or even the RCMP on security cases? Do they have any?
Well, the rationale is always national security, and it's a hollow rationale. I suppose from CSIS' point of view, it's a way of protecting agents in order to continue carrying out their work. But in fact, it acts as a cover for many people to do to violate people's rights and to continue with behavior that's completely unacceptable. And the fact is that we've very seldom been able to get names of officials in these cases. But even when we have, there's not necessarily the legal instruments to hold them to account. I think that we maybe have to go, we can name and shame publicly, but we also have to talk about the structures and the systems and institutions like CSIS that are carrying out, that have a mandate so broad that they can effectively break the law and get away with it. And I think we have to look more deeply than the individuals, but also at the structures that are set up that allow those individuals to operate in that way and continue to do so.
We have a situation in his case, Abdelrazik's case, where he is now back home, thanks to the good work of people like you, Mary, and you, Paul, in Washington as well. But is he ever really going to be able to clear his name? Are there still going to be lingering suspicions?
I think, well, you know, I'm sure Mary can address that as well. Just very briefly, no. I mean, he's always going to suffer that. He's always tainted. Whenever anyone Googles his name, there's always going to be that. You know, Mr. Arar also experiences that. There's still people who write vicious things about him online, and unfortunately, you know, Mr. Abdelrazik's life is always going to be under a shadow. He's always going to have difficulty either getting jobs or maintaining friendships or anything, and it's really quite tragic, I think.
Mary, what can other citizens do now? You mobilized a number of people in Canada to take a look at this case and to support Mr. Abdelrazik. How do we maintain an ongoing watch on these cases?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, Mr. Abdelrazik's case, clearly he is still struggling to clear his name, and there won't be any kind of justice until he's at least had a public apology from the government. And he is fighting in the courts for that. And I think the rest of us can support those cases and continue to question and challenge the logic that ties many of these cases together, which is often a logic of profiling and guilt by association. And I think those are the kind of things we need to be out in the public discussing, bringing to the attention of our other very simple things, just in conversations, challenging some of these things when they come up. Informing ourselves about cases. There are often some of the higher profile cases have good resources out there around them. Informing ourselves and being ready to respond to people who raise questions in our environments. I think that's just a very simple, basic thing that we all should be doing as a matter of responsibility to fight back against some of these trends towards accepting the idea that where there's smoke, there's fire. So I think that's at a very simple level. More broadly, if people want to get, as I think they should, more engaged, I think they need to look in their own networks to see where they can support either the individuals who've quite courageously taken on a public role, so the higher profile cases, or individuals within their own communities who haven't gone publicly but are clearly in situations of precarity or vulnerability because of their profiles or because they've already reached that. So, I mean, a good example is the Canadian Labour Congress, and many of the unions mobilized behind Mr. Abdelrazik in a very interesting and creative way with their campaign Just Work, which was to point out the fact that under this blacklist, Mr. Abdelrazik was effectively prevented from working in Canada, which is everyone's right to earn their living. So they mobilized their members behind that. So seeing the links between the settings that you are in and the rights that are being violated, I think, is probably key for all of us.
But for people who knew the Abdelrazik story and wanted to support, there was a risk for them too. I mean, you might have run afoul of law for helping to buy an airplane ticket to bring Mr. Abdelrazik back. Are citizens running any kind of risk by standing up in these cases?
I think they're running a risk in not standing up in these cases. They're running the risk of allowing a certain set of trends to continue. They're running a risk of losing the rights they have and failing the next generation, their children, and leaving them with a society that's deeply troubled, split, and much more vulnerable to that kind of thing in the future. So I think there's a huge risk in not standing up in these kind of cases, and the kind of risks that people of my profile take when we do stand up is minimal, as opposed to what it will be in the future if we don't stand up now. So.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you very much for your appearance here today, and to Paul Coring in Washington, Paul Champ here in Ottawa, and Mary Foster also here in the studio with me in Ottawa. This has been the webcast, Rights and Security, brought to you by Prism Television.